Well, welcome today to the Children First Family Law podcast. I am delighted today to bring you Ellen Bruno, who some of you who are in the family law world may recognize as the amazing documentarian who has done the split films, which everybody involved in family law needs to watch, both practitioners and parents. And I will have Ellen talk through the two different films that she has done, but they are just absolutely incredible at helping people understand from children's voices what actually kids are going through. And so welcome, Ellen, and thank you. I'm just privileged to meet you and have you here today.
Thank you, Krista. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
So let's get started just by talking a little about maybe give us just some background on how you got into filmmaking, because I know you've done a
Mhm,
wide variety. I mean, give us some of your passion
mhm,
projects, and then we can talk about what struck your heartstrings that made you start to do this work in the area
mhm.
of divorce? Because it's a little different than some of your other work.
Right. Yeah. Well, I actually had a previous career as doing refugee relief, and I was working in refugee camps, going back and forth between Southeast Asia for about 10 years. And in the course of direct service work, you see a lot of things that aren't being recorded in the news, and there were just a lot of gaps, and I had a lot of access to stories and issues and people that reporters didn't have when they sort of flew in and flew out. And so I was pretty motivated to find ways to tell the stories of the people that I was seeing in war zones and refugee camps. And that really was my motivation to get into filmmaking, was really trying to facilitate the voices of these people that really did not have voices. And so that's really what launched me into filmmaking. And for many years, I had one foot in filmmaking and one foot in direct service work. And so I was continuing that work. And then at one point, I was sitting with a 10-year-old friend on a hillside, and he started talking about his parents' divorce. And I thought, wow, things are not much different than when I was a kid. I grew up in a very small Italian Catholic community in Rhode Island. My parents got divorced in the 60s. Nobody in town was divorced. And with all the best intentions, my parents really thought the best way to uh, um, manage this for the four kids was to talk about it as little as possible. Even though my mother's friends were coming and sitting at the kitchen table and sobbing over a cup of coffee. I can't believe this is happening. Oh, the poor children. And of course we're within earshot, but
Right.
this sort of a very well-intended silence. And at that point, I was about 10 or 12, and I had a very active imagination, and my parents would go into the bedroom, for an hour and come out, and clearly they were upset. And then they'd say, let's go have ice cream.
Mhm.
Being super nice. And so in my child's mind, I concocted really the worst case scenario, which was that actually I thought I was dying. I had a minor medical issue that got lost in the weeds in the course of their divorce. And I just put two and two together and ended up with five. And really, it was quite traumatic for me. And and again, they were well intended. They didn't know. It's what people did. Don't upset the children.
Right.
And then I found myself years later with two small children separating from my partner. And I realized, wow, you know, divorce really still is the monster under the bed of many kids. There is still this kind of a shroud of silence that's both protecting parents and they think protecting children. And I started to realize there was nothing available for my kids, and there was no vehicle to encourage my kids to really talk about what they were feeling, outside of a direct conversation with me or their dad. And also, there was a lot of shame, and there was a lot of silence among their peers. And I thought, well, you know, everybody seems to be doing it in our culture these days. Half of my kids' friends, their parents were divorced. How can I start the conversation? How can I hopefully begin to normalize it, or at least let kids know that they're not alone? The feelings that they're having are quite common. and quite healthy in many ways. And so that was really the genesis of the first film. I stepped out of my um, work around human rights, mostly in Southeast Asia and Asia, and sort of stepped aside for a moment to gather a group of these kids in the Bay Area and just sit down and talk to them and give them the platform. So that's really how the film began.
How would a professional, a mental health professional or an attorney,
Mhm.
theater, how would they go about doing that? What does that cost to be able to provide it to their clients?
So the for law firms, mediators, mental health professionals, the streaming licenses are $250 a year, or for both films, it's $450. Now, we work with nonprofits, we work with people that have low budgets. We're very flexible. Our mission is to get these films to as many parents as possible.
Mhm.
The way it works logistically is our tech team creates a portal that's branded, say, the Miller Law Firm. And so a link is sent to a parent, and the Miller Law Firm logo is on top, and it says, you know, welcome to uh, um, the Split Films. The Miller Law Firm welcomes you, and you'll watch this film or two films, and be sure to pay attention to this. And if you uh, want to share the film with your children, these are things you need to pay attention to. Be sure you watch it first so you had your experience of it and you're prepared for conversations with your children if you choose to share the film with them after you've viewed it. And so just very simple instructions, but it's very colorful, it's very user friendly. And also the films, I think it's important that the films are very colorful and
Yeah.
user friendly. They're not
Yeah.
kind of yucky and creepy, and they don't feel like homework. They're actually entertaining and sweet and endearing. So it's not a really negative experience to watch these films. Kids love the films.
Yeah.
They feel so heard and they feel so recognized. And what's really interesting is I went to my niece's classroom. There were a bunch of 9-year-olds sitting on the carpet watching the film, and you could see in the course of the film, it was very clear which kids understood this experience from their own perspective.
What are your thoughts about the risk of not listening to kids or ways we should be, other thoughts you have on, why we're not and how we should?
Well, I think why we're not is because, well, from the parent's perspective, it's almost unbearable. It's almost unbearable to know that a choice you're making is going to cause your child pain. It's going to be difficult. That's not universally the truth, but it's often the truth, right? So that alone is is really difficult for parents. However, to take that fear and turn it into a more empowered, yes, the choice you're making is going to be a struggle and a challenge for your child or your children, but you have the ability in very simple ways to frame this experience in a much less painful way for your child and to move through this experience in a way that really does minimal damage. Um, and and so there's something about these children being sort of ambassadors from the world of children, sort of proxies, right? Because the voices cannot show up in much of the system. And so if enough of children's experiences are reflected in these films, and these films can be considered by both professionals and parents, I think that's in many situations, that's the best we can do at this point. You know, just listen, pay attention, and ask the question, how can I do something even politely differently that encourages a better outcome for children and for parents alike? I have to keep saying that because I think that's something, it's not just about the kids, it's about the experience of the parents. And they need to understand that the choices they make are going to have a major impact on what their experience is like moving forward for the rest of their lives. right? How comfortable it is or is not for them to be standing at their child's high school graduation, or how awkward it is to have a schedule to see the grandchildren because you cannot be in the same kitchen together. There are ways to avoid all of that, which is going to be better for your well-being and your happiness, as well as your children. And so I think um, that very simple fact is critical and becomes an opportunity to do even a very slight pivot that can change the experience for both kids and parents.